What's up, scholars? Welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be talking about volumes 4, 5, and 6 of Skip Beat. So where we left off last time was in the training school camp where Kyoko was going off against those girls, and President Takarada's granddaughter Maria was there causing havoc and all of this because of how the story was really messing with her, and we get Kyoko doing the acting test. Before we get into it, this one will be a little more spoiler filled as we get further into the series. It's going to be very hard to keep it spoiler free, especially because of all the information and all the details we get throughout these 3 volumes and volumes going forward. So I guess this will be your official spoiler warning if you haven't gotten to 4, 5, and 6 of Skip Beat yet. 4, 5, and 6 is really when things start to set into place with our main crew. We get more of Kyoko and her building her relationship with Maria, but also her building her relationship with Kotanami, Kane'S, and we get to see more of her just pure hatred for Sho, and the way her relationship begins with Rin. And we get a lot of information in these 3 volumes specifically regarding Kyoko and her past, and especially her situation with her mother. And I'm excited to just dive right into it. So let's just go ahead and talk about it. So here is my review for 4, 5, and 6 of Skip Beat. Volume 4 picks off exactly where Volume 3 ended during the training arc. I say training arc, it's a training school arc. And Kyoko is taking part of this acting test where she is basically changing the script around and saying, yes, your father hates you. A parent can hate their own child. And of course, that's very hurtful to Maria because her mother was killed in a plane crash and she thought all the adults blamed her. People were blaming her because she asked her mom to come home for her birthday to celebrate with her. So they're blaming this child, this little girl, for the death of her mom. And of course, she said people have tried to tell her, oh, it's not your fault, but she hears them talking behind her back, so it makes her distrust all the adults. And she sees Kyoko as like this shining light because Kyoko doesn't pull any punches and she tells it like it is. And she's just very blunt, and she doesn't try to sugarcoat anything to Maria, even though Maria's a child. And when Maria first met her at the LME audition, she saw this part of Kyoko when Kyoko confronted her there, and so she had hope that Kyoko wouldn't be somebody who would lie to her like that and sugarcoat things. And she definitely got her wish because Kyoko doesn't sugarcoat a thing. But as soon as Kyoko says a parent can hate his own child, referring to the father, Maria gets offended because deep down she knows her father doesn't hate her. And it's a whole debacle. It actually gets really into like the psychology of Maria's mind and how she's viewing her relationship with her father and how she's reacted to her mother's death herself, and realize like it's the grief in that family is so messy and it's not a good situation. And because of Kyoko's bluntness, because she is just very direct and she doesn't pull any punches, but at the same time is able to turn it around to prove to Maria that her father doesn't hate her. It impacts Maria so much more that Kyoko was able to do it that way because there was truth behind her words and she wasn't lying. And Maria felt as if she could let her guard down in front of Kyoko and she didn't have to pretend. And it was just a really nice moment. I love that part because it really establishes this sibling type relationship that Maria has with Kyoko. Because Maria, after this, she starts calling Kyoko her sister. And Kyoko at first is like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm not your sister. Eventually she gets used to it and just kind of accepts it as it is. But because Maria ends up interfering with Kyoko's acting test, the people at the acting school say, well, that doesn't count, you still have to pay your way in. So Maria actually accidentally messed things up for Kyoko, but Kyoko was like, oh no, it's fine, don't worry about it, I can still pay in installments. And as they're going back, one of the best scenes and following that scene is when Kyoko and Maria get back to LME, and Maria asks Kyoko for advice of what she could talk about with her father. And that's when we get a lot of information about Kyoko's family situation, because Maria's like, oh, well, what do you talk about with your father? And Kyoko just freezes, and she's like, I don't have a father, which is already very telling. And Maria's like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. And Kyoko's like, oh, it's fine, don't worry about it. And then Maria just drops the bombshell, and she's like, well, what do you talk about with your mother? And we get this just panel of like her doomed expression, like the weight that question just put on Kyoko. It's so telling without her even having to say anything. And Maria's thinking she's made another mistake by like, oh no, like she doesn't have a mom either. But Kyoko's like, no, don't, like I do have a mom, but like we don't have that type of relationship. She really tries to play it down for Maria's sake. And after Maria leaves and she's left alone with President Takarada, he asks about, you know, her family situation, because since she's still technically a minor, she has to have her guardian's consent for her to debut. And the facial expression we get from Kyoko in that moment is so sad. It's one of the most just genuine, heartfelt expressions we've seen from her thus far in the series, and it's because she's talking about her mother honestly. She's like, she's never cared about me. She doesn't care where I am or what I'm doing. Do I honestly have to have her permission in order to debut? If I don't get her permission, do I have to leave? And of course, as soon as Takarada sees this, he can't pry any further, and he can't refuse her. He's like, no, you don't have to leave. And he can't pursue that line of questioning anymore. And after they depart, he's kind of reminiscing on it, and he's like, well, I thought her acting was a little too realistic when she was talking about a parent hating his own child. And now as he's thinking about it, he's like, well, what has that girl been through? And we get even more on Kyoko's mom and like their dynamic later on in volume 6 during a separate arc. But before we get to that, we get this awesome moment where Kyoko has this little blue stone that she calls corn. There's a whole long backstory to why she calls it that, but she calls it corn, and then she thinks it's this magic stone. Kyoko is a full-on believer. She thinks magic is real. She believes fairies and princesses and all the stuff, that she thinks all of that is real. And she thinks corn is a magic stone that can take away her sadness. And because she believes it can, it really does, because it's in her head that it'll make her feel better. But Sawara ends up spooking her while she's sitting on the stairs with the stone, and she ends up dropping it down who knows how many floors. I actually don't know how many floors of stairs. Her facial expressions just keep getting better in this series, and I love them so much. But her facial expression here, when she realizes she's dropped the stone, is hilarious. And of course, who else would come across the stone on the floor other than Rin? And this is where we get some juicy backstory with Rin, when we realize that he actually knew Kyoko when she was a kid, when she was younger and he was younger. He knew her, but she doesn't recognize him. She doesn't know who he is. And even though he realizes who she is, he doesn't say a word to her. But he still continues to pick on her, and I wouldn't necessarily say bully, but he kind of bullies her because of his understanding of her reason to be an actress, of why she is pursuing acting, is because he thinks it's all for revenge, which is one of her main motivations. Even though he sees the stone, he knows he's the one who gave her the stone. He doesn't say anything, and instead he kind of teases her for it and gets her riled up to the point where she makes a very crude gesture at him, which shocks him so much because he's like, who taught her that? And I love that panel. It's so funny for no reason. And while he's thinking about what she did to him, he is like, I'm shocked at how much people can change. But this encounter with Kyoko has kind of shifted his perspective on how he views her, because before he just held this anger and hostility because he didn't like her reasons for acting. But now that he realizes that he knew her, he can't help but have some of that emotion and feeling from when they were younger. Moving on, before we get to the main arc of these 3 volumes, I say it's the main arc because the last arc kind of bleeds into the next volume or so. So I can't really count the last one as like the main one. So the main arc is, I don't know if it's called the Battle Girl arc, but it's the arc with Kyoko and Kane'S. But before that, we get this bit with Kyoko, and she's going to a comedy show pretty much. They've been hired to go out there, and she ends up in a chicken suit called Bow, which she is not happy about at all. And to top it off, as she's in this chicken suit, she realizes that the main guest star of this comedy show is none other than Sho. And at first she is just absolutely horrified to be in the same room as him because she doesn't want him to discover that she's in a chicken outfit. But then she's like, oh, this is the perfect time for revenge. I love Kyoko so much because despite all of her best efforts, it always ends up backfiring on her. Every time she tried to thwart Sho's reputation or ask a question that would make him seem less desirable to the public, it ended up backfiring on her and made him look even better to the public eye, and she was so mad about it. And it even got to the point where Sho figures out that it might be Kyoko inside the chicken suit, and he humiliates her, which that part was awful because of the way he humiliated her. The way he humiliated her was just terrible, and one, infuriated Kyoko even more, understandably so. But she ended up getting in trouble for his actions, and that's when she realizes that when you're a star like he is, you see, like, he seems untouchable, that no matter what he does, he's not gonna really get punished for it because he's the star. He's in this shining place that she is not. She cannot reach it. And she becomes disheartened at the fact that because she's like this lesser known talent, that she's down at the bottom, she's always gonna get the brunt of everything until she can make it up to his level. And it sets her back a little bit, and she originally gets fired for Bow, but she actually gets the job back by a stroke of luck, pretty much. But what gets her back on her feet is actually an encounter she has with Ren, which he was the last person she wanted to see after her disaster meeting with Sho. And then of course she runs into Ren right afterwards, and Kyoko is trying to vent her anger to Ren by making fun of him and calling him names and just saying all sorts of horrible things. And he ends up getting angry, and she gets scared of how angry he is and apologizes. And she's very honest. She was like, I'm sorry I said all these things because I hate you. Which makes Ren laugh because he's not used to having people be so honest and straightforward with him. This honestly begins a long-running gimmick in this series of Ren's unlikely partnership and companionship with a chicken. There's like this mutual understanding between Ren and Bow, Kyoko, that Ren doesn't really act the way he acts around everyone else. Like, his mask drops in front of Bow because of the way Kyoko went at him this first time, and he thinks he can say anything he needs to around this chicken, which is hilarious because he would never say these things to Kyoko, but he's saying it to Bow, which is Kyoko. It's a whole thing, and I love it. It's so funny. Kyoko ends up explaining that she was fired and she didn't want to take off the suit just yet, and Ren says, well, that's dumb. And Kyoko's like, well, you wouldn't know, like, you're this mega superstar. I bet you've never been fired. But then Ren sits down with her, unknowing, of course, but sits down and explains all the different times he got fired and starts naming them off on his finger. One, making him seem much more human in Kyoko's eyes, and making her realize that it's not the end of the world if she gets fired from a job, that there's still plenty of opportunity out there there's still a way for her to rise to someone of Ren's level. If he's done it, then there's possibility that she can too. Then of course we get the interesting tidbit of information that Ren got his start in America, not Japan. And of course he acts very cocky and confident about it, and of course that makes Kyoko so mad that she ends up storming off after he says thank you for her helping him inadvertently. But that little interaction between Sho and Kyoko, and then Kyoko and Ren, while it seemed very simple and didn't really have a lot of impact at first, everything that happened in that little bit comes into play later on. Maybe not even in these 3 volumes, but it comes into play later on in other volumes and chapters in the future. And I think that's so cool. But as this little bit of arc is wrapping up, we get this hilarious moment between Ren and Kyoko when she's back out of the costume, and it's at a later day after she's already got her position as Beau back and she's now a regular on this comedy show. She sees Ren again, but realizes that she's never apologized for making that gesture at him, and fears that he's still gonna be angry at her. And as soon as they lock eyes, Kyoko turns around and practically runs away from him. While I love the scene in the manga is hilarious and I love it, but I love the way the anime adapted this particular scene, and it was so funny. What the anime didn't do was accurately portray Ren's facial expressions. He's so much more expressive in the manga than he ever was in the anime, and I'm so sad that they didn't get all of Ren's facial expressions, because he has some of the best expressions in the series. But yes, Ren basically corners her right in front of the bathroom and starts teasing her and making fun of her because she didn't greet him when they first met, or he knows that she thinks he still hasn't forgiven her or is holding a grudge and everything. And he teases her about that, and after she apologizes out of fear, he starts laughing because he's thinking of when she was a child, and he's like, oh, she hasn't changed, she's still the same as she was back then. And then of course Yashiro comes in and he's like, what are you doing to her? Why are you cornering her outside of a bathroom? Because Yashiro was like, I was scared you were bullying her, and Ren's like, oh, I'm sorry for making you think that. I wasn't doing that. And Kyoko's just walking beside him like, he kind of was. But that interaction kind of clears up the air between them before this next arc, and he actually encourages her in this moment to go for this audition that she was talking about, which leads us into the next main arc of these 3 volumes. It is where we get to see the fruition of Kyoko and Kane'S friendship, and I love every single bit of it. I love their friendship. Their dynamic with each other is hilarious, and I love how they can argue with each other, bicker with one another, and encourage one another, and they feel confident with with each other at their side. And we see this get established in this arc when Kyoko is going to audition for a commercial, and she meets Kanae there, and that is when we are introduced to someone who has pretty much tormented Kanae all of her life, Koenji. Erika Koenji. Because Kanae bested her in an acting play, I think, once when they were in elementary school, and Koenji held a grudge for that ever since, and has pretty much made it her life's mission to ruin Kanae's chances of acting, because how dare she beat her. Which, that is upsetting. That's just angering in and of itself because of how petty some people can be. But it is realistic because there are petty people like that in real life. Lo and behold, as soon as Kanae is wanting to go for this commercial as well, Koenji shows up because she's trying to thwart Kanae from getting any spotlight. And of course, at first, Kyoko doesn't understand what's going on. She's just upset that Moko didn't greet her. They start having one of their little bickering arguments, and Kanae drops the bomb that she sees Kyoko as her rival, which infuriates Koenji because Koenji has been Kanae's self-proclaimed rival for all of these years, that to hear her say that she has an actual rival just drives her off the wall. And of course then she has to go and belittle Kyoko for being a plain woman, that she's not wearing any makeup, yada yada yada. And that lights a fire under Kyoko for her to start fighting back. But the thing about Koenji is that she's from a very wealthy family, and she often uses her family name to get her roles and to get her influence in these auditions, and that's exactly what she tries to do again this time. And Kyoko and Kane are kind of left just appalled as all these other girls start fighting to take over the spotlight once Koenji tries to make the deal right then and there, and they're all fighting with each other. And afterwards it just leaves Kyoko and Kane in like this daze, and they're like, well, that sucked. And while they're alone, that's when Kyoko gets to hear Kane's side of the story of what Koenji's done to her, how she has basically dragged Kane down for so long, to the point where Kane feels helpless and hopeless about ever being a star as long as Koenji's there. The actual director of the commercial itself ends up overhearing their conversation, which intrigues him about these two battle girls. And during their conversation, Kyoko slaps some sense into Moko, quite literally. Basically says, you cannot give up. You have, if you ever want to be a star, if you ever want to be an actress, you have to fight. Kane gets inspired by Kyoko's words, and she's like, well, how do I fight? How am I supposed to fight against her? Like, tell me how. If I fight, I can act, right? So tell me how I can fight. And Kyoko, of course, thinks of the one way for them to stand out the most in this audition and to bring all the attention on themselves. And that is through the Love Me's bright pink jumpsuit. And Kane is mortified at the idea of them wearing these jumpsuits to the audition. But Kyoko convinces her, and it's like, no, this is a curse that only we have this, only we have this advantage. It's a once in a lifetime thing. Only we have. So let's use it. And so they do. They show up the next day in their bright pink jumpsuits. And I love that the dynamic between them just snaps into place as soon as Koenji comes in, and their target is immediately set on her. They are ready to fight. They're ready to bring everything they have against Koenji. And that begins the acting test that the director comes up with, because now he doesn't just want one person for the commercial, he wants two, because he was inspired by the conversation that they had the day prior. And they draw pairs, and by chance or by luck or fate or however you want to see it, Kyoko and Kane get paired up, and that begins their acting test together. And although Koenji basically tries to refute it and say, no, it's not fair, they're from the same agency, they shouldn't be able to do this together, Kane settles, saying, fine, we don't need any rehearsal time, we don't need to prepare anything, we can be separate and just act together when the time comes. And of course Kyoko, she's like, what are you talking about, Moko? I need the time. I need preparation. But they end up being separated in different rooms, and the way they act together is just incredible. There's an understanding between them without having to have words, without having to have prior discussion. They are able to react to one another perfectly. Kane says she feels confident that she feels like she cannot lose as long as Kyoko is beside her. She doesn't know why she has that confidence, but she feels like Kyoko won't let her down. And Kyoko doesn't. In their first acting test, Kyoko responds to Moko's acting the way Kane envisioned it, and is so happy that Kyoko did, because it meant she could trust her. And because of the way their first acting test went, the director was incredibly surprised, not only by Kane's acting of how she was able to draw this whole scene just on her own without having Kyoko help her out, but also with Kyoko's acting ability, because she was able to respond to Moko in the heat of the moment without any prior preparation. So we get to see more of Kyoko's acting bits in this one, which is also really cool. She is a very good actress. Then comes the second acting test at the end, where Kyoko was actually spied on by Koenji, and Koenji actually steals the routine that Kyoko had originally planned to do, because in Koenji's mind she said, well, it's whoever does it first, that's who wins. And she used the actual product that the commercial was for, the Cura bottle or can. Kyoko, after the initial shock and despair of being like, no, like that was exactly what I had planned, that was my routine for us, instead of waiting until the very end so she had time to come up with a new routine, she thinks of a new routine within seconds and is like, no, we're ready to go. There is just a fire lit under her. She is just full rage mode as she goes to get 2 bottles, or a bottle and a can of Kyura for their routine. And of course Moko at first is like, what are we talking about? I have no idea what you're doing. I have no idea what's going on. And she starts panicking until Kyoko says, just follow what I do. And in that instant, any worry that Kane has disappears. And she feels instantly reassured. She's like, why do I feel like I can't lose? It's the same feeling she had before. And she doesn't understand why she feels this way, but she is happy that she does. And I love the second acting test, because as they're going through it, the end of it where they're both laughing together, it is their genuine laughter. It's not even them acting completely in that moment. It is genuine laughter as they're looking at each other and their responses to each other. And that moment just completely solidifies their friendship. It sets it in stone. And it is such a wholesome moment, and I love that for them. The way they did the routine landed them a spot in the commercial. They won. They beat Koenji, which was their main target. And of course, Koenji at first, she does not accept defeat at first, and she's like, well, if Kane's face is injured, she can't appear in the commercial, so I'm gonna go try and injure Kane so that she can't appear, so that she can't be in the commercial. Which is such a scummy thing to do. That is just so awful. Koenji's original thoughts and her mindset was just terrible, that she would go that far just to belittle someone and just to make sure that she was above a person. It's ridiculous. But of course her attempts fail, and Kane gives it to her straight. She has this grand speech about how Koenji needs to step down from her pedestal pretty much and get her hands dirty before she can ever consider herself a rival. And Kane says, if you do all of this, then I can call you my rival. And those words really seem to hit home and resonate with Koenji, and it changes her entire mindset. Of course, she doesn't show it at first, but she leaves Kane alone after that and just heads out and is left with those words. And Kyoko is so proud of Moko and is so happy for them. And that is the first day pretty much as their official friendship. That's when their official friendship starts. And it's so precious because these two, they make such an unlikely pair of friends, but they balance each other out just perfectly, and I love their dynamic. After this arc ends, that leads into the next one, which is Kyoko being a substitute manager for none other than Rin, because Yashiro got a cold. So this is when we get to see a lot of Rin's true personality come out during his interactions with Kyoko. Kyoko, bless her heart, she brings a lot of these things on herself, and as she is getting told to be Rin's substitute manager because Yashiro has a cold, Rin, of course, is not happy to hear this. He doesn't really want to deal with anybody else, and he doesn't want to deal with Kyoko specifically. So at first he just tells her to go home, that he doesn't need her around. She refuses, of course, and is like, well, no, I was told to be your substitute manager. I have to do what I'm told, pretty much. Rin basically says there's nothing you can do for me as my manager, and Kyoko under her breath is like, well, it's not that hard. I could be your manager. Of course, Rin hears it, turns around, and he's like, oh, really? Okay, then let's see what you do. Poor Kyoko. Like, she did bring that completely on herself. But it's so funny, and she messes up being a substitute manager at first a whole lot. She doesn't get to carry his stuff because he does that. He's not going to let her do it. He has to protect her from all the fans that are crowding them in places. She knocks things over and he has to apologize for her. And a lot of things, and it makes her realize, one, she's super uncomfortable because she keeps messing up and she's not having a fun time. She is not enjoying herself at all, and other women are envying her because they're like, oh, she gets to spend so much time with Suruga, that she's so lucky. And Kyoko's sitting here and was like, what is so lucky about this? I am suffering. But all of this makes her realize that she took being a manager, even a substitute manager, too lightly, and she ends up apologizing to him. And he forgives her, but she's still like, you're angry about something, but I can't tell what. And her little grudge Kyoko comes out because she's like, no, my antenna's not wrong. I know you're angry about something, but I just don't know what it is. But they end up going to a restaurant, which is so funny. The reason Kyoko was assigned to Rin was to make Rin eat because he has terrible eating habits. He doesn't eat if he's by himself. All the directors and managers knew that if Kyoko was with him, he wouldn't let a girl go hungry, so he would eat with her. The fact that he has to have somebody with him in order to remember to eat is just crazy. And we see this more in this arc. He is a total child. He is an absolute child. Kyoko ends up getting hungry and Rin finally notices. And at first he asks her what she wants and she tries to like play out. She's like, oh, well, whatever you want is fine. And he's like, okay, boiled frogs. And she's like, no. By doing that, he forces her to choose a place to eat and she ends up wanting a hamburger steak, which apparently she loves hamburger steaks. And Rin remembers from when they were little, she would always find these stones and pretend they were hamburgers. And he remembers that and he tries so hard not to laugh as he's watching Kyoko eat because he realizes that there are a lot of things about her that haven't changed and that she's still pretty much the same girl that he knew besides the hatred. And we see his first real glimpse of affection for Kyoko when she talks about how good the food is and he smiles and he's like, it certainly seems like it. And of course Kyoko's reaction to that isn't to get all warm and fuzzy or blush or anything like that. It's the sense of dread of like, what was that? Which I love so much because she is so immune to love at this point in this part, at this point in the story, that it's so funny to see her reaction to genuine affection like that. But she ends up ruining dinner because she overhears these girls talking about how Rin would never be caught in a family restaurant like that, but also because they talk about high school and how she's not in like her high school uniform or anything like that, reminding us that Kyoko never got to go to high school because of a certain someone, aka Sho. And because she gets reminded of that, she flies into a fit of rage in the middle of the restaurant. And Rin ends up leaving and honks the car to get her to come outside. And of course, again, she realizes that her outburst has made him angry, but she doesn't know how to apologize to him for it. But Rin ends up asking her about high school and why she didn't go, and Kyoko ends up telling Rin everything. She tells him about Sho, she tells him about how he used her and betrayed her and left her, and why she wanted to be part of the industry in the first place. And Rin then lays it to her straight. He's like, I'm sure you have your reasonings, but as a fellow actor, I find it unpleasant, the reason you're doing this. And that's when Kyoko realizes, like, oh, that's why he's angry. He's angry because he thinks I'm doing this solely for revenge. And that's when she realizes that they have a misunderstanding between each other. But before Kyoko can clear it up, she tries to apologize to him, or she tries to tell it to him, hits the top of the ceiling, forgetting they're in a car, and then her cell phone goes off, forgetting she had a cell phone because she's not used to having one, and it's the president telling her that she can go to high school. All she has to do is study for a transfer exam, take the exam and pass it, and she can go to high school. Now, on top of being his substitute manager, she's now getting to study for this test, and she takes it so seriously. But she gets distracted by her studies the next day because of Rin. She realizes that Rin is getting sick. That he must have caught Yashiro's cold, and so she tries to warn him preemptively of it, and he acts like an absolute child because he's never had a cold before. So he is so proud of the fact that he's never had a cold, he thinks he can never get one, and brushes her off, and they start arguing and quibbling like an old married couple, and he's acting like a 2-year-old saying that he doesn't have a cold when Kyoko is clearly right about him having a cold. And then the next day, the panel is so funny. I love this panel. It says the man, the woman, and Kyoko is holding a thermometer that clearly states he has a fever. And Rin at the bottom is just pouting and sulking so much. And he's like, why did I have to get a cold? Like, he honestly acts like a child about it, and it's so funny. But he ends up apologizing to Kyoko because she was right, and he was like, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have been so proud and stubborn about this, I should have just listened to you. And Kyoko doesn't really know how to handle the apology because she's not used to people apologizing to her when they are in the wrong. Rin is still, even though he has a cold, he is still determined to do all of the acting work that he has on their schedule. And Kyoko at first is like, no, like, you have a cold, you need to rest and take medicine and get better. But he pretty much just tells her no. And of course, one of the scenes that they are going to be doing that day is a rain scene. And Kyoko is so against it, but Rin's like, no, I asked for it, this is the only day we have on location, we have to get it done. And Kyoko is just amazed at his dedication and the tenacity he has and the love he has for his work. And it makes her kind of realize a few things of like, no, like, he's serious about this, so I need to be serious too. So she goes off and gets him all sorts of medical supplies, all sorts of things that can help treat his cold. But the scene that made her realize all of this about his dedication and his love for his work is the scene where he passes out on top of her after the rain scene is done. He won't respond to anything she says. He will only respond when she says the line of the actress he's working with. And it's like he snaps back to consciousness and wakes up, delivers the line to her in character. Scares her half to death because he had fallen on top of her and now he's just hovering over her saying these lines. And then even after he gets up, after he's like, oh, you're not Yumiko. Oh, okay, let's go. That's when she tells him that he needs to stop and rest, that he can't do anymore. And the look he gives her makes her realize that dedication and love. And that's when she decides she's going to do everything in her power to help him. And by the time she gets back from running all of her errands and getting everything she needs, she takes Rin back to his home. Basically prepares like all these like cold patches and all this different food that he can actually eat even though his throat hurts so much. The compassion that she shows him and the dedication to helping him out makes Rin realize he's overlooked a lot of things about her because of this revenge plot, and he's forgotten how kind and compassionate she was and realized that that side hasn't left her either. And that's when we get the scene where he finally, for the first time, this is the first time in the series, he actually calls her by her name, but he calls her by her first name. When he wakes up, when she's changing the cooling pad, and he says, thank you, Kyoko. And it throws Kyoko for a loop because, first of all, he's never even called her Mogami before. And she's so thrown off by him calling her name that she can't even focus on studying and realizes she spent the whole night in a daze not learning a single thing even though her exam's coming up. And there's a bit of comedy in like their morning routine after he gets up, but the main thing about that is once he drinks the stamina juice or whatever she had made for him to give him energy throughout the day, he was like, oh, you're lying, this tastes awful. And she's like, I was talking about the energy, I didn't say anything about the taste. And Ren says, "Do you really hate me that much?" And Kyoko doesn't respond to him, and it shocks him. And he's like, "Well, I mean, it makes sense. I've only done things that would make her hate me." But he still thinks, he's like, she's doing all of this for me, even though she hates me. And it makes him realize that she is still doing things for others without any regard for herself. Which was Kyoko's realization when she started studying for the exam, because her mother always demanded a 100. She would only get praise if she would get a 100, a perfect score on a test. Anything else, and she was scolded for it. And because Kyoko got scolded anytime she didn't get a perfect score, that determination to just work at things she hated and to do things she didn't want to do until she got praise, until she got the best that she could get on it, that stuck with her so much and has gone through her with her life, which she's been so scarred by her mother. And Ren realizes what she's doing and realizes that even though he thinks that she hates him, she still can't help but do her best, because that's what's been drilled into her from when she was a child. And he remembers that the more she hated something, the more she fought against it. Like, she hated studying, but she was determined to get 100 on the test so her mother would praise her. And he's sitting there and he's like, well, that's good, but how is that going to help her in the end? How is going for something she hates, like this revenge, how is that going to help her in the end? And he starts thinking more about her, thinking that she should be focusing more on herself and what she wants to do, and devoting more time for herself and devoting more time to her and not others. But once he realizes that he's thinking more about Kyoko than he is his script and his acting, he has to snap himself out of it, and he's starting to read his lines out loud because he still is a little foggy-headed because of the fever and all that. Kyoko runs into him, hearing him practice his lines out loud, ends up hiding from him even though she doesn't really have a reason to, but realizes that he's probably having trouble memorizing his lines because of the fever, and ends up saying the lines in the script back to him, proving that, first of all, she had already had his script memorized, that she had read it enough to memorize it herself, and knew exactly where he was at, exactly what to say, and the tone of how to say everything. And when Ren hears her acting, he is just honestly surprised. He can't believe that she is doing it so well, that the tone and the inflection is perfect, that she's saying everything clearly. And he's so thoroughly impressed with her. And he's like, is this really an amateur who's been studying for just 6 months? The volume ends with him just having this shocked expression as Kyoko is smiling. And he's like, is this really all for revenge? And this is really, the end of volume 6 is really the turning point for Tsuruga in regards to how he feels about Kyoko. It's the beginning of his hatred, or his displeasure, I would say, for her motivations fading away as he's realizing there's so much more to Kyoko than what he originally thought and what he was originally hung up on. And it leads into the next volume where we continue the end of this arc. I guess you would call it the substitute manager arc. I don't really know if there's an official arc name for this one or not, but that is the end of volume 6. So there was a lot in these 3 volumes. There's a lot here. There's a lot to talk about. I know I didn't hit on everything, but I hit the high points, or at least I tried to. I really love these 3 volumes in particular because of the information we get on Kyoko's backstory and her relationship to her mother, and the fact that she doesn't have a dad. And I love the connection we get to Ren, that he actually knows Kyoko. They were close friends in the past, but she doesn't recognize him, but now he knows who she is, and that has changed his perception of her as well. I love the development we get with Kane and Kyoko, their friendship. I love their friendship. It's one of the best things about this series. Their friendship is done so well. and the beginning of it really blossoming in these volumes, and that one arc is just so great. I really, really love to see them work. And again, I love the art style. I love Kyoko. Her facial expressions are always a 10 out of 10. And I love how expressive this manga is, like with Rin or Yashiro, even Kane, because the facial expressions just make this manga so much more fun. They are hilarious, and it gets you to, like, I don't know about you, but it draws me into the story. It is one of the funniest manga I've ever read, and a lot of that is due to the facial expressions of these characters. And a lot of it's to do with Kyoko, because she's one of the best MCs I've seen. I love the way she develops through this series, and there's not too much development from her here in these 3 volumes in particular. The biggest development for her here is the fact that she is friends with Kane, and she had a realization from her confrontation with Sho, and there are lessons she is learning from her confrontations with Rin, not just after, like, the confrontation she had about him losing, you know, him being fired, but as she's his substitute manager, there's a lot she learns from him and watching him work and his dedication and love for acting. So that's all for this review. I know it was kind of long. Going forward, I don't know if I'm gonna do it the same format, if I want to do more than 3 volumes at a time, if I'm gonna do it in a different way, or if y'all like this format where I just kind of talk about what's going on in the 3 volumes and kind of talk about how I think about it, how I feel about it. If y'all like that, let me know. If y'all like to see a little bit of a different format, let me know about that. Let me know down below. Since Skip Beat is one I have read so many times, and I'm not experiencing it for the first time as I'm doing these reviews, if y'all want me to do it a little bit differently, I would be totally open to that, because it's not like my One Piece reviews where I am reacting to it for the first time. Since this is mostly a reread series where I am doing just reviews of the series as a whole because I love it so much, if y'all would like to see it in a different format, just let me know. But other than that, I adore Kyoko. She is a fantastic main character, and I love her so much. And anytime I get to talk about her, even if it's just talking about what happens in the comedy or her relationship with Kane or Rin or anything, I just love talking about it. I could talk about it all day. So next time, unless something changes, I will be doing volumes 7, 8, and 9 of Skip Beat, where we're getting into some good, juicy content. The next 3 volumes are fantastic, and I love them. They have a lot of character development for Kyoko. So if you've read the first 6 volumes and you haven't seen a lot of development for Kyoko yet, just hold on. Those next 3 volumes is going to blow your mind with everything that she does. But until then, thank y'all so much for watching this video. My schedule for March should be up by now, so if you haven't seen it, make sure you go to that community tab and check it out, because it should be posted there so that you can see what I'm going to be posting in the next month. But that is all. So thank you again, and I will see you next time, scholars. Bye!